What's going on there, guys? Today we're going to be using Photomotion Horizon to animate this rocket launch. We're going to be using Photoshop to split this image up into several layers and then use After Effects to add further movement to each individual layers. So let's get to it. Now, with our image in Photoshop, what we're going to want to do first is duplicate our background layer, then use the quick selection tool to start creating a selection from our first layer. Our first layer is going to be the tarmac at the bottom just over here, and once we're finished, we'll just go over to select and mask at the very top here and really finite our edges. Within this image, we're also going to want to add some of these structures to our first layer here as well. And once we're done, let's go to output to the side just over here and change this selection to new layer with mask in order to create our first layer. Once we're finished, just click OK, and then we're going to bring our selection back by holding Control and then clicking on this mask over here. We'll then disable our first layer and enable the layer below, ensuring that it's also selected. What we'll want to do then is just expand our mask by going over to select, then modify and expand. We'll set the amount here roughly around 10 pixels. We'll then use Content Aware by right clicking on our selection, ensuring that we have the selection tool selected, and then right clicking over here and just hitting fill. Just make sure that contents here is set to Content Aware and hit OK. Cool, so there are a few imperfections with our image, but we can see to fixing those using the patch tool just over here. What we're initially doing with this step is just using the better parts of our image to fill in the information about what is initially behind and below the tarmac. We'll also use the clone stamp tool just over here and bring the flow to something like 3%. Again, we'll want to do exactly the same as above, but we'll want a very soft and light touch to get rid of some of these imperfections that still sit within our image. So now that we're happy with our image, let's start with the second layer. Much like last time, we're going to use the quick selection tool in order to grab our exhaust here, and then we're going to click on select and mask just up here again in order to iron out these finer details within our selection. Now, with stuff like exhaust or maybe even clouds, keep to using a light touch in order to get the best results. And once we're done, we'll then make sure to change the output just over here to new layer with mask, which will bring our selection into its own independent layer. So select our mask from the new layer, and like last time, we'll disable this layer and select and enable the layer below. Again, what we'll be doing is expanding our mask by going back over to select and modify, then expand. We'll then again right click on our selection and see what Contents Aware fill makes of this part of the image. Now, this isn't too bad, but let's get to fixing any issues that we're seeing with the sky in the background here. We'll also have to look at expanding and maybe fixing some of these towers too, and we can achieve some of that by using the spot healing brush and just cleaning up some of these areas of our image and maybe adding some more onto these elements. Remember, in our animation, parts of these will be extensively covered by the tarmac that we separated earlier, as well as this exhaust here too. So we'll still extend these out to the very end of our image in order to make sure that we have plenty of options, but remember, it's not essential that it looks A-star. Again, we're hardly going to see any of these imperfections within the final results. So once we're done, let's look at separating these towers and this launch pad out into its own independent layer and creating a mask for them. But this time, when we get to perfecting our edges by clicking on the select and mask, we'll also want to make sure to get rid of any sky that we're seeing within our mask. Remember at this point to use light touches, try and be as accurate as possible. Taking your time is absolutely essential. With that in mind, we'll change our output again to new layer with mask in order to create this layer. And the last step here really is to do exactly the same of what we've done beforehand, making our selection visible, ensuring that we have the right layer enabled and selected, then expanding it a very small amount, and finally using Content Aware Fill to fill in some of the gaps of what was behind these towers here. Not too bad here. Now, we don't need to go into extensive amount of details. We're just going to use the patch tool to get rid of some of these edges that are prevalent within our image. So much like the towers, what we can do is expand upon this image and extend this exhaust coming out of the engines here. So let's get to that by using the lasso tool just over here and dragging it further below. We'll then use the eraser tool with a soft setting in order to remove some of these edges to make sure that it blends in a little bit better. Well, this doesn't look bad. Next, let's ensure to merge this with the layer below, layer 1, by selecting both these layers, right-clicking and selecting Merge Layers, allowing us to easily select the rocket and all of the remaining exhaust in the next step. We'll rush through this next part, but as said before, we're basically just creating a selection from this rocket and the exhaust here, and ensure to pick up every last detail when we get to select and mask. We'll then ensure to bring back our selection to the layer below and expand, finally creating our clean plate by using Content Aware Fill to quickly fill in what's behind this rocket. And there there we go, each one of our layers, great stuff. Let's make sure to rename our layers in Photoshop in order to make sure that we don't get lost within After Effects. So the tarmac here will be layer 1, plume will be layer 2, towers and the launch pad will be layer 3, and the rocket being layer 4, with this sky here being the clean plate. Lastly, let's not forget to save our progress here in a convenient place for us, and now to the fun part, animating our image. After accessing the latest version of Horizon, you'll be greeted with this splash screen, and as most of you are aware, just make sure to double click on this Start Parallax button. So the first step of this will be to add our Photoshop project into our Photomotion one. We can do this by just double clicking on the Add Photo button over here and just dragging in our Photoshop file. Just make sure at this junction that when we see this pop up, our import kind is set to composition, as we don't want our layers combined back into one. So from here, all we need to do is just import our clean plate into this background layer. So let's find our clean plate, drag it into our composition, and then parent it to this top layer here whilst holding shift. From this point, we'll just need to scale it using the parented layer. Once we're done, our dashboard will open up, but of course there's still the rest of the layers to contend with. So let's get to that now. Let's start by just jumping into layer 1 here, clicking on import, and then dragging this tarmac layer into our composition, moving it above this layer just here. And since we've done the scaling beforehand, no need to scale it again, just simply parent it to the layer above whilst holding shift, and that will copy all of the attributes across. So with one layer down, let's get to doing exactly the same with our second layer. We'll again go to import, drag in this layer to the composition below, making sure to bring it above this layer and parent it to the layer above whilst holding shift to copy those attributes from the clean plate onto this layer. Now with layer 3, we'll also import our towers and the launch pad, but we'll also import the rocket into this layer too. So just parent layer 3 to the layer above whilst holding shift, and then we'll do exactly the same to the rocket here in order to scale everything proportionately. We'll also drag this rocket layer below the towers. Clarification, this time do not fiddle with the parented layer above. We only want to change the positioning of the rocket, not the whole project. So let's bring this rocket down a tad so it looks like it's just left the arms here, and that's pretty cool. So for layer 4 within the project, what we'll do is add some more exhaust here by reusing layer 2 from our Photoshop project. So again, just drag and drop layer 2 from the project window and parent it to the layer above, and in order to change its appearance, let's select the Photoshop layer itself and offset some of the positioning and rotation so it doesn't look exactly like a carbon copy of layer 2. And you can see the difference if we flip between the composition layer 2 and layer 4 here. So with our layer set up, let's get to creating our cage. Since it's a fairly straightforward image, nothing too much needed to be done here, but just expand our backplate here, and once we're done, just click on this animate button and enable our animation features by clicking on this checkbox in Effect Controls. So with our layers and cage fully set up, let's get to creating our animation. First, let's drag our playhead to the very end of the composition timeline. We'll then add some movement by using our controller here, and then we'll click on the magnifying glass icon at the very top and change the zoom. We can also change the vertical movement by clicking on this icon at the bottom of our controller and changing to the degree that we want to see movement up or down, and maybe tweaking the multiplier too. We can also change the tilt by clicking on the icon to the very left of the controller, or by changing the values within this layer, Control Tilt, which will also add a degree of tilt to our animation either left or right. Our animation is looking okay, but the problem that we're having is that we're seeing some negative space above our animation where there's this little white part. Obviously we can't have that within our animation, so let's get rid of it by clicking on Other on the main dashboard, and then in Effect Controls we'll drag up this white edge fix, which will then mirror out our clean plate and extend the sky. So let's preview our animation and see how our project is coming along. Well, it's looking quite decent. Now at the moment we're missing some depth and positioning between our layers, so if we click on layer 4, we can also change the Z-axis of the layer itself and change how much depth lays between these layers. Let's do this for all 4 of our layers. Once we're happy, let's get to adding some additional movement to our animation. First, let's sort out this rocket here by going into layer 3, disabling this launch pad here, and then adding an additional liquefy effect here and animating the distortion mesh. Before we get to animating anything, let's just make sure that what we're doing matches up with our main animation. Now, if we go back to the main dashboard, we can see here that the animation is 179 frames long. Although, if you've chosen a different point to animate, animate, this number will, of course, be different. Also, if you're seeing time instead, press and hold Control and then click on the time code here to flip it to frame count. So if we go back to layer 3 and type out 179, our playhead will skip to that point. Press N on your keyboard in order to mark out the end of your work path, and then we're home free to making some adjustments. So making sure the liquefy effect is selected, let's get to adding some additional dynamic movement into this animation by dragging down this condensation and exhaust from this rocket. We can also preview what we've done here by just dragging along our time head, and if we want to, we can still make a couple of adjustments. Just make sure that if you're doing so, your time head is at the very end of your working area. Okay, so what we'll also want to do is add in some movement. So with our time head at the very beginning of the composition and the launch pad layers re-enabled, let's bring back our base positioning attribute and click on the stopwatch icon. We'll then want to bring our time head to the very end of the working area and then just drag along these Y-axis attributes. We'll also select all of the keyframes within this composition and change them to easing by just hitting F9 on our keyboard. And what that will do is just make our animation a little bit more smoother at the beginning and end. Once we're happy with our rocket animation, let's go back to the main dashboard and look at adding a couple more elements. So with our rocket now fixed up, let's get to adding some more movement to this exhaust here. Let's jump into layer 2 with this initial pocket of exhaust and add some puppet points to the overall outside so we can create a small amount of movement. Once we've done so, once again, bring our time head to the very exact point where our animation finishes. Remember, we found out that it was 179 frames into the composition. We'll also hit N on our keyboard to mark out. So with that over and done with, let's drag these points along so we can create a small amount of quote-unquote expansion. Try not to overdo it, of course, as subtlety can go a long way, especially with animations like these. So once we're happy, making sure that the layer is selected, hit U on your keyboard in order to bring up all of the keyframes within this layer. And all we're going to do is just convert them to easing by again making sure they're all selected and then hitting F9 on the keyboard. Right, cool, so let's do the same with layer 4 here, where we have this pocket of exhaust at a slight rotation behind our animation. Once again, we'll use the puppet tool just over here, and then we'll create a series of puppet points. We'll then get to, once again, bringing our animation time head to the end of our animation length, marking out and adjust these points to give the illusion that this pocket of exhaust is, once again, expanding outwards like it would do in real life. So once we're happy and in the main dashboard, let's just preview our animation and see what we have. Alright, it looks cool. We're seeing a lot of movement, which is good, and it looks very convincing. Let's just add the final touches in here by just doing some color corrections and adding some particles. So let's just go to color here over on the main dashboard, and when we get to the curves in effect controls, let's just bring down some of the darker tones within our animation. Okay, so that's looking cool. Once we're happy, let's go over to the settings button over in particles, and then we'll click on this checkbox in effect controls, what will enable particles. Obviously, we don't want these default petals, so let's swap them out for these specks here and then change how transparent they are by changing the channel over here to alpha and then taking out some of the highlights on this curve. So if we bring our playhead to the very end of our animation, we can also see about adding some blur. So if we go over to camera settings, we can add so by just increasing this blur strength, but you can of course do so from the main dashboard and then go to effect controls. So once we've increased this value, we just need to enable the effect by going over to effect controls and then clicking on this checkbox under depth of field. We'll also uncheck the default lock focus on layer 1. The tarmac isn't exactly the most interesting part of our animation, and then check on layer number 3, our rockets here. Okay, so not much more to do but just change our export resolution. So let's go over to here to this resolution button on the main dashboard and click on it and then navigate back to effect controls. We'll be changing this export resolution here from 1080p to 4K. Just a quick FYI, of course, you can do this at any point within your animation, and of course it won't affect playback. Awesome, so just click on the export button just down here, and since our time head was already at the end of our animation, 179 frames, we're already getting a green light for exporting our animation without a loop. Just make sure to mark the end of your work path, of course, otherwise you'll still be rendering out goodness knows how many loops. Alright, so let's bring this to render by clicking on composition and then add to render queue. Keep in mind that we will have to change the export export format by clicking on this lossless button down here and just swapping out this AVI format up here to QuickTime, which will give us a .mov in the end. Hit OK, and then all you need to do is of course just click render. And there you have it, our animation is now ready for the world to see. If you have any questions about this tutorial, please give a shout to our live chat, and as usual, we hope you've learned something new today. Take it easy, and until next time.